As we draw closer to the new chapter for World of Warcraft, stepping into the World Soul Saga with the War Within's release, it feels like for many there's never been a better time to either return to World of Warcraft retail or try and start things out as a new player. However, despite knowing you'd be joining and diving into a new long-term storyline, there are still issues that new players regularly encounter. And whilst I think retail is back into a healthy enough state to start the World Soul Saga, this rings true only for established players. As for the new player experience, it's still, well, a little confusing. And one might state that retail WoW is simply too hard for new players to get into, due to being disheartened or simply not understanding what on earth is going on. And with a confusing mix of expansions to try and understand or take on, an overwhelming amount of choice at character creation, as well as the fact there are so many versions of World of Warcraft now available, it could be stated that the new player experience is a big issue that World of Warcraft needs to address, to tackle and set up in preparation for this new era of Warcraft. So let's take a look at some of the issues facing new players in World of Warcraft and just how can these be addressed. But just before we jump in, as always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here, as it helps me out a bunch. So thanks very much indeed. Now, let's get on with it. So firstly, in my experience, I've played WoW for near enough 17 years. However, during Shadowlands, I decided to stop playing retail and go over to Classic WoW full time, simply due to not feeling like I connected with the point retail was at anymore. And I had a great fun time running through Classic WoW and reconnecting with what made me love the game in the first place. And when Dragonflight was released, I decided to give retail another go. However, to me, too much had changed in such a short space of time, and I didn't really understand what was going on, so I gave up and I headed back to Classic. However, much like a disappointing ex-girlfriend turning up at your door with flowers, promising they'll change if you take them back, when Aberrus was announced for Dragonflight, and I saw Daddy Neltharion stood there in all of his glory, amongst several giant bosses made of fire, I decided to give things another shot with retail. And hey, those cheap supermarket flowers worked a treat, and I took retail lovingly back into my arms. But a key note here was that to really understand where we were with things in retail, after going full on with Classic for some time, I had to level up a main from level 1 again, simply to come to grips with new updates, talent trees and playstyles, as I felt out of the loop somewhat. And now I love retail WoW again. I thought Dragonflight overall was great, and I'm excited for the War Within as we head into the World Soul Saga. But the main point here was that I'm someone who has played WoW for nearly 2 decades. And even I struggled to jump back into retail after a break. So how on earth are new players meant to do this out of the blue and then actually think retail is worth giving a shot? So similar to my experience, what are new players facing currently as issues? Well, let alone deciding which version of WoW you want to play, given there are 3 main versions, which is already confusing enough to a new player who thinks they just want to play World of Warcraft. But in this case, let's suggest that they haven't pre-decided which version they want to try and they've settled on retail being their new spot. All existing players know the ultimate first boss of WoW, which is also one of the hardest, the character creation screen, which greets new players in an overwhelming powerhouse for the senses, existing of content driven right into your eyes, ears and nose, as your hands begin to tremble at making a simple mistake in a character creation process that feels like you're making one wrong step and that's it for the next 10 years. I mean, even I still get a bit scared when I look at it now. And then you get to the point of Horde versus Alliance, as well as the fact that each race has certain benefits, alongside some races not being able to play certain classes. And when you finally decided on your race and your class, you can start the process of playing RuPaul's Drag Race in designing your character. And once that's done, hey presto, time to play. Try picking a name that's unique in a 20-year-old game that also has seen me have an embarrassing selection of character names. And then finally we're done. Here we go, boys. You, a player who has never played before, must choose a leveling zone based on basically no information. And the main point I'm trying to drive here is that whilst it's great to have variation for character creation, new players are greeted with an overwhelming amount of choice, to the point where it could feel like too much effort to even decide what to play in the game. A game which they realistically have no commitment to, alongside deciding what starting zone they then want to go into. I think realistically this needs to change, as although Exiles Reach is a good idea, it still feels very alien to World of Warcraft. And to be honest, we're much better off trying to go to basing new player tips in the original zones. But this is just my preference, as the original zones feel more like a true reflection of the experience of World of Warcraft, and would give a new player a better taste of the game. And all of this choice alongside your respective starting zone feeds into one big issue. Once all decisions on your character character have been made, we don't really have a simplistic or straightforward leveling process that currently makes sense to someone who hasn't been around for even the past 4 expansions, let alone all of them. For some reason, the game seems to want to push you into battle for Azeroth, which as an expansion has no relevance on what is going on at this current time, and retail simply can't flow in the same way Classic does. For example, in Classic Wrath, you still have to level through Vanilla and BC to get to Northrend, but Classic Wrath isn't overly bloated by content, so this process is still straightforward and makes sense somewhat. But with retail, we're not at the same point anymore, and we can't benefit from such simplicity. This needs to be overhauled. However, in terms of coming round to understanding how to play your class, I would argue that retail does a good job of this with the current talent trees and the progression of skills that are added to your hotbar, but at some points it still does feel a little bit rushed. The main point still revolves around the fact that the game is meant to guide a new player experience in a way that helps them understand their role in the world and why they're doing the content that they're doing at that point. Yet the current new player experience reflects one where you're not really coming to terms with how you should maybe feel or fit in World of Warcraft, as the leveling process can feel quite isolating if you're questing in old zones or different expansions, and the only way to see other players is through dungeon spamming. And for me, I think Chromie Time as an idea is excellent, and I love it to spam dungeons from old expansions on new alts as a blast of nostalgia. But nostalgia doesn't exist for new players. The system is actually quite confusing if you are unfamiliar with it, and it's not always clear where to start questing, although there is some okay guidance for it. But generally it seems that for current leveling, a new player has to put more effort in to understand what on earth is actually going on, and what expansion they want to play unless they fancy playing Battle for Azeroth, which I'd give a big but for these issues, I saw them all come to light firsthand when my girlfriend, yes, unbelievably, I have one despite being a WoW player, then my girlfriend decided she fancied giving World of Warcraft a go, as she knew it's one of my favourite pastimes and she has a bit of an interest in gaming, but had never played an MMORPG before. She reached the first boss, the character creation screen, decided to play a Pandaren as she likes Kung Fu Panda, and also bought me a WoW cookbook with a giant panda on the front. She took a long time and struggled with what class she wanted to play, until she saw hunters get pets, which decided it for her. Yes, she picked a hunter, it's a red flag, I know. But the main thing was she loved how the world looked, the narration and the fact she was a panda, but it took her a bit of time to get used to the camera style, field of view, and what you're supposed to even be clicking on, as well as the overstimulating attack you get as a new player when you begin to open screens by accident, such as your bag space, before you're even able to start questing. And well, after leveling in Pandaland, not much made sense to her after that either. But the truth is, it was a difficult process, and she had fun with it and enjoyed the initial Pandaren quests in a cool zone, with tasks that gently eased a new player into a massive world with so much to explore. But this was all with the benefit of having someone there who had played the game for over a decade at hand, if she had any questions, which not all players do have the benefit of relying on. So how do we fix such confusing issues? Well, the new player leveling experience doesn't need to be complicated. It needs to be fairly easy and simply make sense. Hence why Vanilla Era has been loved for so long, as by level 10 you've put in a bit of a shift and have come to terms with the basics. And we have a prime opportunity to reinstate some of these great aspects with the upcoming World Soul Saga. As if big changes are coming with the World Soul Saga, and in their words, it's time to come home or join in on the ride now, you better start cementing a better new player experience and leveling system that makes sense. Cataclysm, for all its downfalls, did revamp the world in a way that meant your experience as a new player made you feel like you were still taking part in the current expansion for levels 1 to 58, as quests changed in line with Deathwing's impact on the whole world. If the World Soul Saga is going to take account for the world, there needs to be some kind of linear progression put in place for new players to experience, in a way that will suit them for the next 5 or more years. As if they're looking to release the idea of a long-term story, revamping leveling will also suit them in the long term, as it won't require updating whilst the World Soul Saga progresses. We just can't have new players joining thinking they're going to be a part of this new epic 3 expansion storyline, only to be pushed into BFA at level 10, or trying to understand Chromie Time. Early leveling needs ironing out and some common sense pumped back into it. Endgame for retail has always been a bit confined to the current expansion, which is fine. However, by the time you do get to endgame, I think new players do have a lot more helpful tools at their disposal now, such as as Raid Finder to see an easier version of the raids and understand what's going on in some ways. And zones that provide daily challenges and help with gearing, like the Emerald Dream, are great ways for new players at max level to feel like a part of what's going on. For example, the Emerald Dream being able to show you the impact Farak is having, building up to a major sil, as well as explaining some story and helping out with gear. And I think once you have come to grips with how to level in current retail, it is great fun running through dungeons with alts on Chromie time, and then gearing them up at endgame. But the issue is with the first barrier hurdle for new players to climb, and it's still a really big one. So overall, I think Retail can be a game that has great appeal to new players. There are just some issues that need to be addressed for this experience, mostly down to the first impressions of the game, as the early leveling process currently feels like when you have a bunch of wires in a box, and you know they're useful for something at some point, but they're all knotted up and it's almost impossible to know what you're needing to get started. I think removing a few choices for new players at the start makes the game a lot easier to understand. For example, I think we realistically shouldn't have Exile's Reach in the game anymore. It feels over the top, unnecessary, and doesn't really give you a proper feel for the world in any true sense at all. I think you could easily implement a new system in which you experience the original questing areas, such as Elwyn Forest, on a new player mode. That features in the more obvious aspects and hand guiding that Exile's Reach does, at some points while still maintaining the integrity of the zone. And finally, we need the War Within to bring a newer and more streamlined experience to questing that makes players feel like they're up to speed and not taking part in some random expansion anymore. The World Soul Saga is a long-term project, and there is no reason we can't have some form of implementation that connects earlier level questing back to what's actually going on, i.e. the World Soul waking up and talking to various adventures and heroes throughout the world. And it seems you, as a new player, are now part of the World Soul Saga also that everyone else is on board for too. We've seen this happen with Cataclysm in a different manner beforehand, but this really needs to be ironed out now. It makes no sense to start in battle for Azeroth anymore, and only confuses those new to World of Warcraft who already feel like they're 20 years behind schedule. So I suppose in some ways Retail WoW is hard for new players in the fact it's quite complicated and oversaturated with content. It's a real issue if you're completely new to the game when trying to get the hang of things and actually understand what on earth is going on with questing, Chromie time, and World of Menu Craft. And whilst confusing, it really is there for the taking if Blizzard simply tidy things up a bit. However, do let me know what you think. Have you had friends experience these issues, or are you a new player yourself? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.